Chapter 1. Abandoned Among the Stars. The Galactic Council convened under the iridescent glow of the celestial dome, their faces grave as they reviewed the final report on the Nova Wolves. These genetically engineered creatures had been designed to be the perfect biological weapons, faster than any natural predator, more cunning than the most advanced AI, and imbued with a regenerative ability that rendered conventional attacks futile. The Nova Wolves had been the spearhead of the last galactic conflict. Now, their purpose fulfilled, they were deemed a liability. They've outlived their usefulness, announced Supreme Counselor Thralic, a towering Tridentian with translucent blue skin. Their continued existence poses a threat to the stability of this galaxy. But they're sentient, argued Representative Zealer, rare advocate for compassion among the cold-hearted council members. We created them to fight our wars. Now, we're casting them aside like debris. This is unethical. Thralic's eyes narrowed. Ethics have no place in galactic security. The Nova Wolves cannot be integrated into society. They're too dangerous. The motion passed with overwhelming support. The Council's decision was final. The remaining Nova Wolves, including a pregnant female, would be exiled to the desolate, uninhabited moon of Zarkos, 9. Without resources or prey, extinction was inevitable. Zarkos, 9 was a bleak, rocky wasteland orbiting a dying red star. It had no atmosphere to speak of, its surface a jagged expanse of sharp rocks and deep crevices. The Council's ships hovered above, their cargo bays opening to release containment pods. Inside one of them, a massive wolf-like creature growled, her golden eyes glowing with defiance despite the sedatives coursing through her veins. Her name was Kalara, the last alpha of the Nova Wolves. As the pod landed with a heavy thud, the containment field dissipated, leaving her free but stranded. She staggered out onto the moon's surface, her claws clicking against the frozen rock. Behind her, 2 smaller pods opened, releasing her newborn cubs, 2 tiny, fragile creatures barely strong enough to stand. Kalara nudged them gently, her maternal instincts overpowering her fear. She looked up at the ships disappearing into the void and let out a mournful howl, a sound that reverberated through the stillness of Zarkos, 9. For the first time in her existence, she was truly alone. On the far side of the galaxy, aboard a cargo freighter named Starlight Voyager, Captain Ethan Reeve was finishing his shift. A rugged human in his late 30s, Ethan had seen more than his fair share of the galaxy's darker side. He'd fought in the same war that had birthed the Nova Wolves and witnessed their devastating power firsthand. "Another council decree, huh?" muttered Ethan as he scrolled through the latest intergalactic news. The headline caught his eye. Final Nova Wolves exiled to Zarkos, 9. He frowned, his conscience prickling. Ethan had always been uneasy about how the galaxy treated its creations. Soldiers, AI, engineered beings, they were tools to be discarded when no longer needed. It didn't sit right with him, but what could he do? He was just a freighter captain, hauling supplies between colonies to scrape by. Still, something about the story gnawed at him. He replayed old memories of the Nova Wolves in combat. They were fierce, yes, but they weren't mindless killers. They fought with strategy, with a level of intelligence that had unnerved even seasoned commanders. And then there was the fact that they had never turned on their creators, despite their immense power. Was it really right to condemn them to extinction? His musings were interrupted by his ship's AI, Celeste. "Captain, we're approaching Zarkos, 9. Shall I prepare for orbital alignment?" Ethan blinked. "Zarkos, 9? We're not scheduled for a stop there." "It is on our trajectory," Celeste replied. "We could perform a brief survey. The moon is uninhabited, and it may contain valuable resources." Ethan hesitated. It was unlike Celeste to suggest an unscheduled detour, but his curiosity was piqued, and he couldn't shake the feeling that fate was nudging him toward that desolate moon. "Fine," he said. "Set us into orbit." Kalara crouched in the shadow of a jagged rock formation, her cubs huddled close to her side. Days had passed since their abandonment, and the moon offered nothing but bitter cold and relentless hunger. Her body ached from the effort of protecting and nursing her young, but her resilience kept her going. She had to survive for them. A distant hum broke the silence, and Kalara's ears perked up. Her keen senses picked up the faint vibration of a spacecraft entering the moon's orbit. She snarled, her golden eyes scanning the sky for the source of the sound. Ethan's freighter hovered above, its scanners sweeping the surface. "Celeste, report," he ordered. Detecting life forms, the AI responded. Unusual biological signatures. Large creature accompanied by smaller entities. Ethan frowned. "Show me." The holographic display projected an image of Kalara and her cubs. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the species immediately. "Nova wolves," he muttered. His mind raced. The council had made it clear that these creatures were to be left to die. But looking at the hologram, he couldn't help but see the desperation in the mother's stance and the fragility of the cubs. They weren't monsters, they were survivors. Ethan made his decision. "Prepare the cargo bay. We're bringing them aboard." Celeste hesitated. "Captain, this action violates multiple council directives." "Are you certain?" Ethan clenched his jaw. "I've never been more certain of anything." As the ship descended, Kalara growled, her fur bristling. But when Ethan stepped out, unarmed and moving slowly, she didn't attack. Instead, she watched him with wary intelligence, her body coiled like a spring. "It's okay," Ethan said softly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I'm not here to hurt you." Kalara's golden eyes met his, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Against all odds, she understood. With a low, reluctant growl, she allowed Ethan to approach. For the first time in her life, Kalara placed her trust in a human. Chapter 2. Against the Galactic Tide. Ethan stood motionless, a few meters from Kalara and her cubs. The mother wolf's golden eyes were locked onto his, her body a tense coil of muscle and raw instinct. Her cubs mewled faintly, their tiny bodies shivering against the cold, jagged surface of Zarkos. 9. Ethan felt a pang of guilt. This was no place for any creature to survive, let alone ones as intelligent as these. "Easy now," Ethan murmured, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. "I'm not your enemy." Kalara's growl lessened slightly, though her stance remained defensive. She sniffed the air cautiously, her sharp nose detecting no immediate threat from the human standing before her. Her instincts warred with her reasoning. In her mind, humans were architects of war and betrayal. But this one, there was no malice in his scent, no weapon in his hands. Ethan knelt, his gaze never leaving hers. He reached into his utility belt and pulled out a sealed protein bar, unwrapping it with deliberate slowness. "You've got to be starving," he said, tossing it halfway between them. Kalara's ears twitched at the soft thud of the bar landing on the rocky ground. She sniffed the air again, her sharp senses detecting the unfamiliar but non-threatening aroma of the food. With a low growl, she took a tentative step forward, her cubs watching her movements intently. "Take your time," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. "I'm not going anywhere." Inside the Starlight Voyager, Celeste's synthetic voice broke the silence. "Captain, I must reiterate the risk of this operation. The Galactic Council has declared Nova Wolves a Class A threat. Harboring them constitutes treason." "I know, Celeste," Ethan replied, not taking his eyes off Kalara. "But this isn't just about rules. It's about doing what's right. Morality does not negate consequences, Captain. Should the Council discover this, they will terminate your license, impound the ship, and likely imprison you." Ethan chuckled dryly. "They'd have to catch me first." Kalara sniffed the protein bar, her growls reducing to low rumbles. She took the bar in her jaws, chewing cautiously before swallowing. Her golden eyes softened slightly as she glanced at Ethan, her cubs now venturing forward cautiously. The smallest cub, a dark-furred little one with striking silver streaks, stumbled toward Ethan, letting out a curious yip. Ethan smiled softly. "Hey there, little guy," he said, extending his hand slowly. The cub sniffed his fingers, then licked them with a tiny, rough tongue. Kalara growled softly, a warning, but didn't intervene. She was watching, assessing this human, who seemed so different from the one she remembered. Perhaps, just perhaps, he could be trusted. "Let's get you all out of here," Ethan said, standing slowly. "You don't deserve to die on this rock." He signaled for Celeste to lower the ship's ramp. Kalara tensed at the hum of machinery, her fur bristling. The cubs whimpered, pressing against her sides. Ethan raised his hands again. "It's okay. It's just a ship. Warm, safe, and full of food. I promise." Kalara hesitated. Her instinct screamed at her to flee, to protect her cubs at all costs. But her logic reminded her of the moon's desolation. There was no food, no shelter, and no hope here. With a reluctant huff, she nudged her cubs forward and began following Ethan. Inside the ship, the cargo bay had been hastily transformed into a makeshift habitat. Blankets covered the floor, and crates of supplies were pushed to the sides. Ethan had even set out water and more protein bars. As Kalara and her cubs stepped onto the warm metal floor, she let out a low, questioning growl. "It's not much," Ethan admitted, "but it's better than freezing out there." Kalara sniffed the air, her growls fading as she realized the space was safe. Her cubs began exploring, their small bodies awkwardly padding across the blankets. Ethan watched them with a faint smile, his heart warming at their resilience. "You'll be okay here," he said. "I'll take care of you." Celeste's voice interrupted. "Captain, incoming transmission from a council patrol vessel. They're hailing us." Ethan's stomach tightened. "Great. Just what I needed. Put it on screen." A holographic display flickered to life, revealing the stern face of a Tridentian officer. "Freighter Starlight Voyager, this is the GCS Aegis. State your purpose near restricted airspace." Ethan forced a casual smile. "Captain Ethan Reeve here. Just passing through. Thought I'd do a quick scan of Zarkos, 9 for potential salvage." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Zarkos, 9 is under council quarantine. No salvage rights are authorized. State your intentions clearly, or we will board your vessel for inspection." Ethan's mind raced. If they boarded the ship, they'd find Kalara and her cubs. He couldn't let that happen. "Understood, Aegis. Adjusting course now. No need for boarding." The officer's gaze lingered on him suspiciously before the transmission ended. Ethan exhaled in relief, but he knew this was only the beginning. The council wouldn't ignore his presence near Zarkos 9. Kalara watched him carefully, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She sensed his tension, the subtle shift in his scent that spoke of stress. For the first time, she let out a low, almost questioning whine. Ethan glanced at her and chuckled softly. "Yeah, I know. This isn't going to be easy." He crouched down, meeting her gaze. "But I couldn't just leave you there. No one deserves that. Not even a deadly wolf." Kalara tilted her head slightly, her golden eyes softening. For the first time, she let out a quiet huff that sounded almost like gratitude. Ethan smiled. "You're welcome." As the Starlight Voyager left Zarkos 9's orbit, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just crossed a line he could never uncross. But when he looked at Kalara and her cubs safe, warm, and alive, he knew he'd made the right choice. Still, the question lingered in his mind. How far would the council go to punish him for defying their decree? Chapter 3. Hunters in the Void. The Starlight Voyager moved through the endless black of space, its engines humming steadily. The ship's interior, however, was anything but calm. Ethan leaned against the console in the cockpit, staring at the sensor readouts. They showed a faint blip, too faint to be random debris. Someone was following them. "Celeste, confirm proximity," Ethan muttered, his voice low. "Captain, the vessel trailing us remains at a distance of 15,000 kilometers. No transponder signal. It's either cloaked or unauthorized," Celeste replied. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "Council patrol? Highly probable. Their movements suggest they are attempting to avoid detection." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had anticipated this saving Kalara and her cubs wasn't going to go unnoticed. But he hadn't expected the council to act so quickly. If they were caught, the consequences wouldn't just be imprisonment. They would execute Kalara and her cubs on the spot. In the cargo bay, Kalara lay curled around her cubs, her sharp ears twitching as she sensed the tension in the ship. The warm blankets and food had brought a momentary sense of peace, but her instincts screamed that danger was near. She rose silently, her movements fluid and predatory, and padded toward the door. Ethan entered the cargo bay moments later, his mind racing with plans to shake off their pursuers. He froze when he saw Kalara standing, her golden eyes locking onto his with an almost accusatory glare. "You feel it too, huh?" he said, managing a weak smile. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We've got company. The council doesn't want you alive, and they'll come after me for helping you." Kalara growled softly, her hackles rising. Her cubs whimpered at her feet, sensing her unease. Ethan crouched, meeting her gaze. I won't let them take you. You hear me? You and your little ones are under my protection now. Her growl subsided, and for a brief moment, Ethan saw something in her eyes, trust, maybe even understanding. It was fleeting, but it was enough to bolster his resolve. Back in the cockpit, Ethan formulated a plan. Celeste, plot a course for the nebula drift. We'll lose them in the interference. Captain, the nebula drift is a volatile region with significant gravitational anomalies. Navigation is highly unpredictable. Exactly, Ethan replied. It's unpredictable for them too. We don't have a choice. As the Starlight Voyager veered toward the glowing tendrils of the nebula drift, the pursuing ship accelerated. Ethan watched the blip on the sensors grow closer, his hands tightening on the controls. Brace yourself, Kalara, he muttered under his breath. This is going to get rough. The nebula drift was a chaotic expanse of swirling gases and shifting gravitational fields. Ships that ventured too far often ended up lost, their wrecks floating aimlessly in the void. Ethan knew the risks, but it was the only chance they had. As the Starlight Voyager entered the nebula, the ship's stabilizers groaned in protest. Celeste's voice rang out, gravitational pull increasing, adjusting course to compensate. Ethan glanced at the sensors. The pursuing ship hesitated at the edge of the nebula, but then plunged in after them. Persistent bastards, he muttered. Let's see how good you are at flying blind. The nebula's dense gases disrupted sensors, creating a cloak of natural interference. Ethan switched to manual control, relying on his instincts to navigate the twisting currents. The pursuing ship's blip flickered on and off, struggling to maintain its lock. In the cargo bay, Kalara growled as the ship jolted violently. Her cubs cried out, clinging to her fur. She pressed her body protectively around them, her sharp claws digging into the blankets for stability. Despite the chaos, her eyes remained fixed on the door, as if ready to face whatever came through it. Ethan pushed the Starlight Voyager harder, weaving through the shifting gravitational fields. The pursuing ship was larger and less maneuverable, struggling to keep up. But Ethan knew it wouldn't take much for a stray gravitational spike to pull them both into oblivion. Celeste, deploy decoy drones, Ethan ordered. The ship's bay doors opened, releasing a swarm of small, spherical drones. They emitted faint energy signatures, mimicking the Voyager's presence. Ethan watched as the pursuing ship fired at the decoys, buying him precious seconds. Come on, he muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. Just a little further. Finally, the pursuing ship's blip disappeared from the sensors, consumed by the nebula's chaos. Ethan let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling on the controls. Celeste, report. The pursuing vessel is no longer detectable. However, gravitational anomalies remain critical. Recommend immediate exit from the nebula. Ethan nodded, guiding the ship out of the swirling gases. As they emerged into clear space, he collapsed back into his seat, exhaustion washing over him. We made it. In the cargo bay, Kalara sensed the shift in the ship's movements. The jolts and tremors had subsided, replaced by a steady hum. She rose slowly, her cubs clinging to her legs. When Ethan entered moments later, she met his gaze, her growl low but not hostile. We're safe for now, he said, crouching near her. But this isn't over. The council won't stop. They never do. Kalara tilted her head slightly, her golden eyes narrowing. Ethan reached out slowly, placing a hand on the floor between them. I need you to trust me, he said. I don't know why I'm doing this, but I couldn't leave you back there. Maybe I've seen too much injustice to ignore one more. Whatever the reason, I'm in this with you. Kalara stared at him for a long moment. Then, with deliberate slowness, she stepped forward and sniffed his hand. Ethan held his breath as her cold nose brushed his fingers. She let out a soft huff, then turned back to her cubs. Ethan exhaled, a small smile tugging at his lips. We're going to get through this, he said, more to himself than to her. Somehow. But as he stood and returned to the cockpit, the weight of what he'd done settled heavily on his shoulders. He had defied the most powerful organization in the galaxy for the sake of a creature most considered a monster. And now, there was no turning back. Chapter 4, Revelations in the Void. The Starlight Voyager drifted through open space, a faint hum of its engines the only sound within its confines. Ethan stared at the holographic star map in the cockpit, calculating their next move. The nebula drift had bought them time, but the Galactic Council wouldn't stop hunting him or Kalara and her cubs. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. Celeste, Ethan said, his voice sharp, pull up all records related to the Nova Wolves. I want everything classified files, experimental logs, deployment reports. Accessing Council archives, Celeste responded. A faint whir echoed as the ship's AI sifted through encrypted data. Warning. Accessing this information constitutes an additional felony under Council law. Ethan smirked grimly. We're past worrying about legality, Celeste. The holographic display filled with documents, videos, and charts. Ethan scanned through them, his jaw tightening with each revelation. The Nova Wolves weren't just weapons, they had been bred with intelligence and self-awareness. The Council had suppressed records showing that the Wolves had tried to negotiate their survival after the war, but their pleas had been dismissed. These weren't mindless creatures, Ethan muttered. They were soldiers, same as us. One video caught his eye, a Council scientist describing a failsafe encoded into the Nova Wolves' genetics. It was a neural override, designed to force them into submission or shut them down entirely. But the failsafe hadn't worked on Kalara. She'd somehow resisted the Council's ultimate control, and now Ethan understood why she was such a threat. Celeste, find anything on that failsafe, Ethan ordered. Did the Council leave a backdoor for their own purposes? Celeste hesitated before responding. The failsafe was specifically designed to activate via remote transmission. However, the alpha gene present in Kalara has an anomalous mutation, rendering her immune. This immunity likely extends to her cubs. Ethan's heart raced. So, they can't control her or her offspring. That's why they want them dead. Kalara prowled the cargo bay, her cubs trailing behind her. Despite the warmth and food Ethan had provided, she remained restless. Her instincts told her that the human was on her side, but years of betrayal had hardened her trust. She watched as Ethan entered, carrying a small device. Kalara, Ethan said softly, holding the device out in his palm. This is what the Council was going to use to kill you. She growled low, her fur bristling. Ethan knelt, placing the device on the floor. You're more than just a weapon to them. You're a threat to their control. That's why they exiled you. That's why they won't stop hunting you. Kalara's eyes flicked between him and the device. Slowly, she stepped closer, her nose brushing against it. Her growl deepened as if understanding its purpose. I know, Ethan said, his voice heavy with guilt. We created you, and then we betrayed you. But I'm not like them. I won't let them hurt you. Kalara huffed softly, a sound that seemed almost like acceptance. She turned back to her cubs, nudging them gently. Ethan felt a wave of relief. She was beginning to trust him, however cautiously. The ship's proximity alarm jolted Ethan out of his thoughts. He raced to the cockpit, where Celeste's voice rang out. Captain, an unidentified vessel has entered scanning range. It is broadcasting a Council signature. Ethan cursed under his breath. How the hell did they find us? Analysis suggests they planted a tracking signal during the nebula drift encounter. The signal's strength indicates they are preparing to intercept. Ethan gritted his teeth. How long until they're within weapons range? 5 minutes. He slammed his fist against the console. Running wasn't an option anymore. They had to stand their ground. Kalara sensed the tension as Ethan returned to the cargo bay. She stood tall, her golden eyes narrowing as she watched him strap on a holster and check his blaster. They're here, he said grimly. The Council. Kalara growled, her stance shifting into one of readiness. Her cubs whimpered, pressing against her legs. I'm not going to let them take you, Ethan said. But if this goes south, you protect your cubs, no matter what. She tilted her head, a faint glimmer of understanding in her eyes. Ethan nodded, then turned back toward the cockpit. The Council ship loomed large on the sensors as the Starlight Voyager came to a halt. A booming voice echoed over the comms. Freighter Starlight Voyager, you are harboring a classified biological threat. Surrender the Nova Wolves immediately, or face termination. Ethan keyed the comms. This is Captain Ethan Reeve. The creatures you're hunting are survivors, not threats. If you want them, you'll have to go through me. Your resistance is noted, the voice replied coldly. Prepare for boarding. Ethan muttered under his breath. Not happening. The council ship's docking clamps extended, latching onto the freighter's hull. Ethan braced himself as the boarding hatch hissed open, revealing armored soldiers armed with plasma rifles. Stand down, Reeve. One of them barked. You're outnumbered. Ethan raised his hands, a defiant smirk on his face. You think I'm the problem? You have no idea what you're dealing with. A low, menacing growl filled the air, and the soldiers froze. Kalara emerged from the shadows, her golden eyes glowing with fury. Her cubs followed close behind, their tiny growls echoing hers. The soldiers hesitated, their rifles wavering. Open fire, the lead soldier shouted. Kalara moved like a blur. She leapt at the nearest soldier, her claws ripping through his armor. The cubs darted between the others, their speed and agility overwhelming the attackers. Ethan ducked behind a crate, firing his blaster at the remaining soldiers. Within moments, the boarding party lay defeated. Kalara stood over their leader, her fangs bared inches from his throat. She glanced at Ethan, waiting for his signal. Let him go, Ethan said. He'll deliver a message. Kalara growled but stepped back, allowing the soldier to scramble to his feet. Tell the council, Ethan said, his voice cold, that these wolves are under my protection. If they come after us again, they'll regret it. The soldier fled, and Ethan sighed, leaning against the wall. Well, that was a close one. Kalara approached him, her golden eyes meeting his. She let out a low huff, her expression almost approving. Ethan chuckled softly. Yeah, you're welcome. As the Starlight Voyager sped away from the council ship, Ethan felt a strange sense of peace. He had risked everything for Kalara and her cubs, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he'd done something that truly mattered. Kalara lay curled around her cubs, her gaze soft as she watched Ethan. In her eyes, he saw something that hadn't been there before: trust. Looks like we're in this together now, Ethan said, smiling faintly. Let's see how far we can go.